The ceramic faceplate did not simply crack. It disintegrated into a fine white powder, immediately followed by a spray of thick, biological mist. Nira watched, her bioluminescent bells flashing a panicked violet as a sudden, localized frost crept across the temple floor. There was no logic to the movement, just a wet, heavy thud that signaled the end of a high priest's life. Have you ever wondered what truly hides behind the eyes of someone who has spent a lifetime being underestimated? Minutes earlier, the Temple of Eternal Flow had been a sanctuary of perfumed smoke and rhythmic, low-frequency chanting. Nira had been more concerned with the elegant drape of her stinging tendrils than the possibility of a breach. Nira hovered at the center of the dais, a star navigatrix of the Ilmathai, radiating the soft, amber light of a diplomat at peace. Below her, the human sat on a low stool. Connor Shaw was a trophy of a sort, a remnant of a forgotten border skirmish that Nira had turned into a pet project. To the Ilmathai court, he was a curious, bipedal ornament. He was fragile, made of soft tissues and brittle bones that seemed ill-suited for the crushing pressures of deep space diplomacy. The human spent his days performing menial tasks or sitting in silence while Nira negotiated the fate of star systems. He was a creature of profound gentleness. Nira found it charming in a pathetic way. Her tendrils would often hover near him in a gesture of bonded affection, and he would respond with a clumsy, warm-blooded smile. He was a quiet constant in her high-stakes world, a soft thing to return to when the weight of the Ilmathai Empire felt too heavy. Nira rested her primary grasping limb on the throne armrest in a casual grip. The stone was cool against her gelatinous skin. She felt utterly secure. The temple was a fortress of tradition, guarded by the most advanced kinetic shields the Ilmathai could buy. Why should she feel anything but supreme confidence? She was the voice of 1,000 worlds, and her trophy was a man who couldn't even walk through a doorway without making a mistake. He apologized to the door when he bumped it this morning. Nira pulsed to her attendants, her light flickering with a rhythmic, mocking humor. The court rippled with soft, amused flashes. The human did not react to the insult, even though his translator must have caught the frequency. He simply continued to sharpen a small ceremonial stylus, his movements slow and deliberate. Truth is, the human was almost comedically inept at anything involving physical grace. He was the kind of creature who struggled with a simple toaster. He burns toast with a regularity that suggests a fundamental disconnect between his brain and the physical world. Nira found this incompetence comforting. It reinforced the natural order. The Ilmathai were the architects of the stars, and the humans were the clumsy children who needed to be kept as pets for their own safety. But Connor Shaw didn't look up. He didn't defend his dignity. He just sat there, a silent shadow against the glowing grandeur of the temple, his eyes fixed on the floor. Perhaps you should stay a moment longer to see how quickly a shadow can become a sun. The incense smoke didn't just drift. It curdled. The heavy doors of the temple buckled under a thermal charge, and suddenly the air was screaming with the sound of rending metal. The death cult squad arrived in a blur of white ceramic armor and jagged obsidian blades. Panic, sharp and chemical, flooded the hall as the attendants' bells flashed frantic, jagged strobes of violet distress. Nira's own tendrils coiled tight against her bell. She looked to her elite guards, but they were already falling, their kinetic shields bypassed by the cult's localized heat sinks. She reached for the throne armrest, her grip tightening until the stone bit into her translucent flesh. This was the end of the Ilmathai line, she realized. The arrogance of her species had left them vulnerable to the simplest of thermal traps. In the center of the chaos, the human did not move. Connor Shaw remained on his stool, the ceremonial stylus still held in his blunt, fleshy fingers. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just sat there, a smudge of brown fabric against the opulence of the temple, looking almost bored. He stopped blinking. She noticed too late. There was a shift in the air, a sudden localized drop in temperature that made Nira's internal fluids crystallize with a sharp, stinging pain. It wasn't the cult's technology. It was him. He was drawing the heat from the room, pulling the energy into his own center. His stillness was no longer the sign of a victim. It was the eye of a hurricane, a gathering of forces that the universe itself seemed to fear. The lead cultist lunged, obsidian blade raised to end the navigatrix. Connor moved. It was not the clumsy stumble of a man who bumped into doors. It was a predatory blur, a mechanical precision that the Ilmathai sensors couldn't even track. The human stepped inside the arc of the blade, his movement so fast it seemed to bypass the frames of reality. He rose. The air around him shimmered as he vented extreme heat from one palm and deep frost from the other, creating a thermal vacuum that collapsed the cultist's lungs instantly. He drove elbow through helmet. The white ceramic shattered like glass. The mist from the earlier moment wasn't just blood. It was the flash-frozen remains of a man who thought he was fighting a pet. Nira felt her tendrils retract into her body, a primal fear response that left her dim and dying on her throne. She watched him methodically dismantle the remaining squad, a whirlwind of bone-breaking force. Every strike landed with the weight of a planet. He burns toast, Nira thought, her consciousness flickering as she watched him snap a neck with a casual flick of his wrist. He also burns invasion plans. One cultist managed a desperate strike, a blade catching Connor across the knuckles of his left hand. The human didn't flinch. He grabbed the cultist by the throat, the heat from his skin melting the warrior's faceplate into his flesh. It was a silent, brutal execution that left the air smelling of ozone and charred meat. In that moment, he wasn't a man. He was a force of nature. "That was my left hand," Connor said, flexing his uninjured right. The temple fell into a silence so absolute it felt like the vacuum of space. The human stood among the ruins of the elite squad, his breathing steady, his eyes finally blinking again. Nira looked down at her throne armrest. It was no longer smooth. Her panic had been so great, her grip so desperate, that she had left deep, permanent claw marks in the ancient stone. She realized then that he wasn't her trophy. She was his ward. Ilmathai Medical Archives would later note a curious biological fact about humans. Their bones are not static. When a human breaks a bone, the healed fracture becomes significantly denser than the original structure. It is a species built on the principle of becoming stronger through its own destruction. They do not just survive. They adapt to the very force that tries to end them.